Guys, we are reading chapter 10 today of The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And chapter 10 is called The Leech and His Patient. So this chapter is primarily about Chillingworth, the doctor, who it refers to as the Leech, and his patient, in this case referring to Dimmesdale, because we learned in an earlier chapter that Chillingworth has quickly became Dimmesdale's doctor upon the urging of the townspeople mostly, not because Dimmesdale necessarily went looking for one. Okay? Old Roger Chillingworth, throughout life, had been calm in temperament, kindly, though not of warm affections, but ever and in all his relations with the world a pure and upright man. He had begun an investigation, as he imagined, with the severe and equal integrity of a judge, desirous only of truth, even as if the question involved no more than the air-drawn lines and figures of a geometrical problem, instead of human passions and wrongs inflicted on himself. But as he proceeded, a terrible fascination, a kind of fierce though still calm necessity seized the old man within its gripe, and never set him free again until he had done all its bidding. He now dug into the poor clergyman's heart like a miner searching for gold, or rather, like a sexton delving into a grave, possibly in quest of a jewel that had been buried on the dead man's bosom, but likely to find nothing save mortality and corruption. Alas for his own soul, if these were what he sought. So it talks about the fact that prior to Chillingworth's obsession, because really it is an obsession, to find the truth, in particular about Hester's lover, he was a kind, calm, upright kind of guy. And so now that he has become so obsessed with the truth, he's changing. In the last chapter, it talked about how his appearance was changing, it's actually talked about it a couple of times, but it mentioned that he's becoming more ugly, his complexion looks more dark. And so you're going to continue to see changes in him the more he is obsessed with finding this truth that he is determined to find. So he feels like, as a doctor for Dimmesdale, he feels like Dimmesdale's not telling him everything, and that in order to treat Dimmesdale, he really needs to know everything. So he says that because Dimmesdale is such a sensitive kind of character, that his bodily illness is probably rooted in something more spiritual or more psychological that Dimmesdale is hiding from him. And so it's talking about the fact that now Chillingworth is determined to figure out, he goes digging into Dimmesdale to try to figure out what it is he's not telling him. Sometimes a light glimmered out of the physician's eyes, burning blue and ominous, like the reflection of a furnace, or let us say like one of those gleams of ghastly fire that darted from Bunyan's awful doorway in the hillside and quivered on the pilgrim's face. The soil, where this dark miner was working, had perchance shown indications that encouraged him. This man, said he at one such moment to himself, pure as they deem him, all spiritual as he seems, hath inherited a strong animal nature from his father or his mother. Let us dig a little further in the direction of this vein. Then, after long search into the minister's dim interior and turning over many precious materials in the shape of high aspirations for the welfare of his race, warm love of souls, pure sentiments, natural piety, strengthened by thought and study, and illuminated by revelation, all of which invaluable gold was perhaps no better than rubbish to the seeker, he would turn back, discouraged, and begin his quest towards another point. So every time he goes digging around in Dimmesdale's heart or in Dimmesdale's world, his life, all he finds are good things. He finds pure sentiments, natural piety, high aspirations for the welfare of the human race. So every time he goes digging, he just turns up with positive things. And so he kind of backs up and then starts in from another direction, trying to figure out. He's convinced Dimmesdale isn't what he seems to be. He groped along as stealthily, with as cautious a tread and as wary an outlook as a thief entering a chamber where a man lies only half asleep, or if it may be broad awake, with purpose to steal the very treasure which this man guards as the apple of his eye. In spite of his premeditated carefulness, the floor would now and then creak, his garments would rustle, the shadow of his presence in a forbidden proximity would be thrown across his victim. In other words, Mr. Dimsdale, whose sensibility of nerve often produced the effect of spiritual intuition, would become vaguely aware that something inimical to his peace had thrust itself into relation with him. So sometimes Dimsdale would become suspicious that there was something bad. It refers to it as a spiritual intuition. So he would just have this gut feeling that there was something bad trying to interfere with him, but he never really knew what it was or why he felt that way. But old Roger Chillingworth, too, had perceptions that were almost intuitive, and when the minister threw his startled eyes towards him, there the physician sat, his kind, watchful, sympathizing, but never intrusive friend. So it said that Chillingworth had some intuition of his own, so he could sense when Dimsdale was becoming suspicious, and he would back off. Yet Mr. Dimsdale would perhaps have seen this individual's character more perfectly if a certain morbidness to which sick hearts are liable had not rendered him suspicious of all mankind. Trusting no man as his friend, he could not recognize his enemy when the latter actually appeared. He therefore still kept up a familiar intercourse with him, daily receiving the old physician in his study, or visiting the laboratory, and, for recreation's sake, watching the processes by which weeds were converted into drugs of potency. So it said in chapter 9, the one from yesterday, that some people believe that Chillingworth was actually the devil himself, or possibly the devil's emissary, which is like the devil's messenger, that was sent to do battle with Dimsdale, because Dimsdale is such a sanctified soul, right? It's because he's so holy, he's so saintly, that the devil had a tendency to come after people like that, because if you win the soul of someone as saintly as a minister, that would be a great victory. So he should have sensed maybe that Chillingworth was evil or was his enemy, but it says that because he's sort of suspicious of everyone, he never suspects that Chillingworth might be the one giving him these creepy feelings. One day, leaning his forehead on his hand and his elbow on the sill of the open window that looked towards the graveyard, he talked with Roger Chillingworth while the old man was examining a bundle of unsightly plants. "Where," asked he, with a look askance at them, for it was the clergyman's peculiarity that he seldom nowadays looked straightforward at any object, whether human or inanimate, "where, my kind doctor, did you gather those herbs with such a dark, flabby leaf?" "Even in the graveyard here at hand," answered the physician, continuing his employment. "They are new to me. I found them growing on a grave which bore no tombstone, nor other memorial of the dead man save these ugly weeds that have taken upon themselves to keep him in remembrance. They grew out of his heart, and typify, it may be, some hideous secret that was buried with him, and which he had done better to confess during his lifetime." "Perchance," said Mr. Dimsdale, "he earnestly desired it, but could not." So what's going on here is Chillingworth is trying to sort of trick Dimsdale into having a conversation about secrets and people not confessing the things that they should. And because Dimsdale won't tell him what he wants to know, he is trying to trick him into the conversation. So he has this dark, ugly plant that he tells Dimsdale he found in the graveyard on an unmarked grave, that it grew from the dead man's heart as a symbol of the dark secrets that he kept there, things that he should have confessed while he was alive and didn't. Dimsdale's response is maybe he wanted to confess them, but he couldn't. "And wherefore," rejoined the physician, "wherefore not, since all the powers of nature call so earnestly for the confession of sin? that these black weeds have sprung up out of a buried heart to make manifest an unspoken crime. That, good sir, is but a fantasy of yours, replied the minister. There can be, if I forbode aright, no power short of the divine mercy to disclose, whether by uttered words or by type or emblem, the secrets that may be buried within a human heart. So Chillingworth says, well, why didn't he confess these sins then? Why is it left to this dark, ugly weed to show them to the world? Dimsdale says that that's in Chillingworth's imagination, that that's not really how it works, that God is the only one that could choose to reveal someone's sin if he wanted to. He's going to go on to talk about the fact that people who don't confess their sins before they die will still answer for those on Judgment Day. So this is at least the second time that Hawthorne has referenced Judgment Day. This is a big part of the Puritan faith. That's not something that you would need to include in your notes, but it is the second time he's mentioned it. Nor have I so read or interpreted Holy Writ as to understand that the disclosure of human thoughts and deeds then to be made is intended as a part of the retribution. That surely were a shallow view of it. No, these revelations, unless I greatly err, are meant merely to promote the intellectual satisfaction of all intelligent beings who will stand waiting on that day to see the dark problem of this life made plain. A knowledge of men's hearts will be needful to the completest solution of that problem, and I conceive, moreover, that the hearts holding such miserable secrets as you speak of will yield them up at that last day, not with reluctance, but with a joy unutterable. So Dimsdale says that those people who don't confess their sins beforehand will gladly confess them on Judgment Day. They will be more than willing to face them then. Then why not reveal them here? Asked Roger Chillingworth, glancing quietly aside at the minister. Why should not the guilty ones sooner avail themselves of this unutterable solace? They mostly do, said the clergyman, gripping hard at his breast as if afflicted with an importunate throb of pain. Many, many a poor soul hath given its confidence to me, not only on the deathbed, but while strong in life and fair in reputation. And ever after such an outpouring, oh, what a relief have I witnessed in those sinful brethren, even as in one who at last draws free air after long stifling with his own polluted breath. How can it be otherwise? Why should a wretched man, guilty, we will say, of murder, prefer to keep the dead corpse buried in his own heart, rather than fling it forth at one and let the universe take care of it? So Dimsdale says, you know what, you're right. A lot of men do confess their sin. Many men have confessed their sins to Dimsdale. He said some on their deathbed, others while they're still in good health and good reputation. And when that happens, he talks about how relieved they are and how happy they feel to have gotten that sin or that confession off of their chest. And he says, why wouldn't they want to do that? Of course they should do that. Yet some men bury their secrets thus, observed the calm physician. True, there are such men, answered Mr. Dimsdale. But not to suggest more obvious reasons, it may be that they are kept silent by the very constitution of their nature. Or can we not suppose it, guilty as they may be, retaining nevertheless a zeal for God's glory and man's welfare, they shrink from displaying themselves black and filthy in the view of men, because thenceforward no good can be achieved by them, no evil of the past be redeemed by better service. So, to their own unutterable torment, they go about among their fellow creatures, looking pure as new fallen snow, while their hearts are all speckled and spotted with iniquity, of which they cannot rid themselves. Now, this part's really interesting and really important because Dimsdale tries to give a rational explanation as to why some men may choose not to reveal their sin while they're alive. And the explanation is that even though they are guilty, retaining a zeal for God's glory and man's welfare, they shrink from displaying themselves black and filthy in the view of men. because thenceforward no good can be achieved by them, no evil of the past be redeemed by better service. So his explanation is that perhaps some men don't confess their sin because they feel like they still have a lot of good to do in the world. And once they confess that sin, they won't be able to accomplish anything good. The best comparison I can come up with from today's world, and maybe you have a better one, would be criminals. Like if someone makes a mistake, commits a crime, has to go to jail or prison for whatever, I don't know, whatever crime it would be. They commit a felony and they have to go to prison. When they get out of prison after serving their time, for the rest of their life, in some cases, they will always have to admit that they are a convicted felon. So when you fill out a job application, for instance, there's a question on there. Are you a convicted felon? And it's usually a yes or no. So they will have to put yes. The question is, do you not think that's going to impact them and what they can do in the world, even though they've already repented? They maybe not repented, but they've already served their sentence. Of course it will. Is an employer going to say, I'm not hiring you because you're a convicted felon? Often not. But if there are two applicants and one's a felon and one's not, they're probably going to choose the one who's not a criminal. So that's kind of the idea here. He's saying that because they still have good that they want to do in the world, they feel like they can't do it if they confess that sin, so they just don't. Am I saying it's logical completely? Maybe not. You don't have to agree with it, but that's Dimsdale's logic. Chillingworth disagrees. These men deceive themselves, said Roger Chillingworth with somewhat more emphasis than usual, and making a slight gesture with his forefinger. They fear to take up the shame that rightfully belongs to them. Their love for man, their zeal for God's service, these holy impulses may or may not coexist in their hearts with the evil inmates to which their guilt has unbarred the door, and which most needs propagate a hellish breed within them. But if they seek to glorify God, let them not lift heavenward their unclean hands. If they would serve their fellow men, let them do it by making manifest the power and reality of conscience, and constraining them to penitential self-abasement. Wouldst thou have me to believe, O wise and pious friend, that a false show can be better, can be more for God's glory or man's welfare than God's own truth? Trust me, such men deceive themselves. So Chillingworth disagrees, as I mentioned. He says that those men are just lying to themselves. If they really want to serve God, then they should be willing to confess their sins in order to cleanse their soul and be good. Or if they want to serve fellow men, then they should be willing to confess those sins and be seen for what they really are and serve in this other capacity. It may be so, said the young clergyman, indifferently, as waiving a discussion that he considered irrelevant or unreasonable. So Dimsdale is sort of over the conversation, and he changes the subject. He basically says, you know what, maybe you're right. And he says it sort of indifferently, like he doesn't really care. So Chillingworth's attempt to trick him into telling him secrets isn't working. Dimsdale, he had a ready faculty, indeed, of escaping from any topic that agitated his too sensitive and nervous temperament. But now I would ask of my well-skilled physician whether in good sooth he deems me to have profited by his kindly care of this weak frame of mine. So in his attempt to change the subject, Dimsdale says to Chillingworth, so, Doc, how am I doing? Do you think I'm getting better? Before Roger Chillingworth could answer, they heard the clear, wild laughter of a young child's voice proceeding from the adjacent burial ground. Looking instinctively from the open window, for it was summertime, the minister beheld Hester Prynne and little Pearl passing along the footpath that traversed the enclosure. Pearl looked as beautiful as the day, but was in one of those moods of perverse merriment which, whenever they occurred, seemed to remove her entirely out of the sphere of sympathy or human contact. She now skipped irreverently from one grave to another until, coming to the broad, flat armorial tombstone of a departed worthy, perhaps of Isaac Johnson himself, she began to dance upon it. In reply to her mother's command and entreaty that she would behave more decorously, little Pearl paused to gather the prickly burrs from a tall burdock which grew beside the tomb. Taking a handful of these, she arranged them along the lines of the scarlet letter that decorated the maternal bosom, to which the burrs, as their nature was, tenaciously adhered. Hester did not pluck them off. So when Roger and Dimmesdale, or Chillingworth and Dimmesdale, look out the window when they hear a child's laughter, we have Hester and Pearl who are taking a shortcut through the cemetery. And what is Pearl doing? Well, she's skipping from grave to grave until she stops on one and proceeds to literally dance on the grave. This image of this little kid dancing on the grave is definitely suggestive of maybe a witch or maybe the devil. Our narrator yet again implying that Pearl has a little bit of imp in her. And then when Hester tells her she should behave more appropriately, she stops and picks these burrs. Being in Southern Illinois, you know what a cockabur is if you've spent any time out in nature, those little burrs, those little sticky things. So she picks some burrs off the plant and she proceeds to stick them on Hester's scarlet letter because, as we learned earlier, our narrator constantly has Pearl reminding us, the reader, as well as Hester, that the scarlet letter is still the main part of the story. Like, that's where our focus needs to be. Roger Chillingworth had by this time approached the window and smiled grimly down. There is no law, nor reverence for authority, no regard for human ordinances or opinions, right or wrong, mixed up with that child's composition, remarked he, as much to himself as to his companion. I saw her the other day bespatter the governor himself with water at the cattle trough in Spring Lane. What in heaven's name is she? Is the imp altogether evil? Hath she affections? Hath she any discoverable principle of being? None, save the freedom of a broken law, answered Mr. Dimmesdale in a quiet way, as if he had been discussing the point within himself. Whether capable of good, I know not. The child probably overheard their voices, for looking up to the window with a bright but naughty smile of mirth and intelligence, she threw one of the prickly burrs at the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale. The sensitive clergyman shrunk with nervous dread from the light missile. Detecting his emotion, Pearl clapped her little hands in the most extravagant ecstasy. Hester Prynne, likewise, had involuntarily looked up, and all these four persons, old and young, regarded one another in silence, till the child laughed aloud and shouted, "Come away, mother, come away, or yonder old black man will catch you. He hath got hold of the minister already. Come away, mother, or he will catch you, but he cannot catch little Pearl." Okay, so once again, Pearl is remarkably intuitive somehow, at least Hester thinks so. And our narrator presents her here in this fashion, dancing on the graves. And then she refers to the black man. This isn't the first reference we've seen in the book to that name. We know that when Hawthorne refers to the black man, capital B, capital M, he's talking about the devil. So Pearl said, "Come on, Mom, let's go before the devil gets you. He's already got the minister, but he'll never catch me." She's talking about Chillingworth, of course, the one who keeps growing uglier and darker throughout the story. Hester has just called him the devil. The townspeople suspect that he could be the devil. So this is definitely repeated throughout. Hopefully, you're feeling like this is pretty significant. The fact that it keeps coming up tells us it is. So she drew her mother away, skipping, dancing, and frisking fantastically among the hillocks of the dead people like a creature that had nothing in common with the bygone and buried generation, nor owned herself akin to it. It was as if she had been made afresh out of new elements, and must perforce be permitted to live her own life, and be a law unto herself, without her eccentricities being reckoned to her for a crime. There goes a woman, resumed Roger Chillingworth, after a pause, who, be her demerits what they may, hath none of that mystery of hidden sinfulness, which you deem so grievous to be borne. Is Hester Prynne the less miserable, think you, for the scarlet letter on her breast? I do verily believe it, answered the clergyman. Nevertheless, I cannot answer for her. There was a look of pain in her face, which I would gladly have been spared the sight of. But still, methinks it must needs be better for the sufferer to be free to show his pain, as this poor woman Hester is, than to cover it all up in his heart. There was another pause, and the physician began anew to examine and arrange the plants which he had gathered. So when they see Hester and she walks away, Chillingworth says, he kind of comes back to the idea of that unconfessed sin. He says, here's a woman who's obviously made some mistakes, but she has confessed her sin. She's not hiding anything. So do you think that she is better off than someone who hasn't confessed them? And Dimmesdale's response is absolutely, I definitely believe it. However, I can't speak for her. There was definitely pain in her face, like she looked like she was hurting. So I can't speak for her, but I think that she's better off than the man who, or woman, who doesn't confess. Now we're going to switch the topic again, back to Dimmesdale's health. You inquired of me a little time agone, said he, at length, my judgment as touching your health. I did, answered the clergyman, and would gladly learn it. Speak frankly, I pray you, be it for life or death. Freely then and plainly, said the physician, still busy with his plants, but keeping a wary eye on Mr. Dimmesdale. The disorder is a strange one, not so much in itself, nor as outwardly manifested, in so far, at least, as the symptoms have been laid open to my observation. Looking daily at you, my good sir, and watching the tokens of your aspect now for months gone by, I should deem you a man, sore sick it may be, yet not so sick but that an instructed and watchful physician might well hope to cure you. But I know not what to say. The disease is what I seem to know, and yet know it not. You speak in riddles, learned sir, said the pale minister, glancing aside out of the window. Then to speak more plainly, continued the physician, and I crave pardon, sir, should it seem to require pardon, for this needful plainness of my speech. Let me ask, as your friend, as one having charge under providence of your life and physical well-being, hath all the operation of this disorder been fairly laid open and recounted to me? So Chillingworth says about his health, he's like, obviously, you're definitely sick. And I feel like I can heal you. But I'm not sure I have a good view of exactly what's wrong with you. So are you sure you've told me everything? How can you question it? Asked the minister. Surely it were child's play to call in a physician and then hide the sore. You would tell me then that I know all, said Roger Chillingworth, deliberately and fixing an eye, bright with intense and concentrated intelligence, on the minister's face. Be it so. But again, he to whom only the outward and physical evil is laid open, knoweth oftentimes but half the evil which he is called upon to cure. A bodily disease, which we look upon as whole and entire within itself, may, after all, be but a symptom of some ailment in the spiritual part. Your pardon once again, good sir, if my speech give the shadow of offense. You, sir, of all men whom I have known, are he whose body is the closest conjoined and imbued, and identified, so to speak, with the spirit whereof it is the instrument. So again, Chillingworth is saying, well, okay, if you're sure you've told me everything, it's just that sometimes the physical ailment, the physical sickness, is really rooted in something more spiritual, something more psychological, even. Maybe there was some kind of trauma that you've experienced that you've not told me about. He says, pardon me again, I'm not trying to overstep, but you as a man are very close to your spirit. And so I just think there's something more, like your sickness is rooted in that spirit, like your spiritual well-being. Dimsdale's heard enough. Then I need ask no further, said the clergyman, somewhat hastily, rising from his chair. You deal not, I take it, in medicine for the soul. Thus, a sickness, continued Roger Chillingworth, going on in an unaltered tone, without heeding the interruption, but standing up and confronting the emaciated and white-cheeked minister with his low, dark, and misshapen figure. A sickness, a sore place, if we may so call it, in your spirit, hath immediately its appropriate manifestation in your bodily frame. Would you, therefore, that your physician heal the bodily evil? How may this be unless you first lay open to him the wound or trouble in your soul? So Dimsdale tries to end the conversation. He's like, well, you can't give medicine for the soul. That's not what you do. So we don't need to talk any further. Chillingworth totally ignores his statement and he says, well, obviously, this is something spiritual going on that you're not telling me. So how can you expect me to heal it if you don't tell me what it is? No, not to thee, not to an earthly physician, cried Mr. Dimsdale passionately, and turning his eyes full and bright and with a kind of fierceness on old Roger Chillingworth. Not to thee, but if it be the soul's disease, then do I commit myself to the one physician of the soul. He, if it stand with his good pleasure, can cure or he can kill. Let him do with me as, in his justice and wisdom, he shall see good. But who art thou that meddlest in this matter, that dares thrust himself between the sufferer and his God? With a frantic gesture, he rushed out of the room. So Dimsdale says that if it is a spiritual illness, like if it's rooted in a spiritual issue, that's between he and God. And he he tells Chillingworth, how dare you, as some doctor, try to come between a man and God, because that relationship obviously would be sacred to Dimsdale. So he storms out. It is as well to have made this step, said Roger Chillingworth to himself, looking after the minister with a grave smile. There is nothing lost. We shall be friends again anon. But see now how passion takes hold upon this man and hurrieth him out of himself. As with one passion, so with another. He hath done a wild thing ere now, this pious Master Dimsdale, in the hot passion of his heart. So Chillingworth talks to himself right there, and he's like, well, that's okay. We're not going to worry. Yeah, he's upset, but it was time to move on to this step. We'll be friends again. And then he takes note. He's like, look how passionate he got about that conversation, about this topic. Yeah, I'm pretty sure he's capable of passion. It proved not difficult to reestablish the intimacy of the two companions, on the same footing and in the same degree as heretofore. The young clergyman, after a few hours of privacy, was sensible that the disorder of his nerves had hurried him into an unseemly outbreak of temper, which there had been nothing in the physician's word to excuse or palliate. He marveled, indeed, at the violence with which he had thrust back the kind old man, when merely proffering the advice which it was his duty to bestow, and which the minister himself had expressly sought. So basically it says that once Dimsdale calmed down, he felt like he was out of line, that Chillingworth really hadn't said anything that Dimsdale hadn't asked him to say. He asked him for his advice, for his honest opinion. Chillingworth gave it. With these remorseful feelings, he lost no time in making the amplest apologies and besought his friend still to continue the care which, if not successful in restoring him to health, had in all probability been the means of prolonging his feeble existence to that hour. So Dimsdale apologized and told Chillingworth that he still wanted him to continue treating him, because even if he couldn't save him, he at least credits the fact that Chillingworth's probably the one that's at least kept him alive so far. Roger Chillingworth readily assented and went on with his medical supervision of the minister, doing his best for him in all good faith, but always quitting the patient's apartment at the close of a professional interview with a mysterious and puzzled smile upon his lips. This expression was invisible in Mr. Dimsdale's presence, but grew strongly evident as the physician crossed the threshold. "A rare case," he muttered. "I must needs look deeper into it. A strange sympathy betwixt soul and body. Were it only for the art's sake, I must search this matter to the bottom." So every time Chillingworth leaves Dimsdale's room, he has this smile on his face. I can't remember the word it used. I'm sorry. It says a mysterious, puzzled smile came across his lips every time he left Dimsdale's room from examining him or treating him. It came to pass not long after the scene above recorded, so a little while later, like another day, that the Reverend Mr. Dimsdale, at noonday and entirely unawares, fell into a deep, deep slumber, sitting in his chair with a large black letter volume open before him on the table. It must have been a work of vast ability in the somniferous school of literature. Okay, somniferous has to do with sleeping. So he fell asleep reading. It must have been pretty boring. That's what it means. The profound depth of the minister's repose was the more remarkable inasmuch as he was one of those persons whose sleep ordinarily is as light, as fitful, and as easily scared away as a small bird hopping on a twig. To such an unwonted remoteness, however, had his spirit now withdrawn into itself that he stirred not in his chair when old Roger Chillingworth, without any extraordinary precaution, came into the room. So he's fallen asleep while he's reading. It's noon. He usually is a really light sleeper, but for whatever reason, he is sleeping really deeply. And Chillingworth comes into his room to check on him, and he's not even trying to be especially quiet, but Dimsdale doesn't wake up. The physician advanced directly in front of his patient, laid his hand upon his bosom, and thrust aside the vestment that hitherto had always covered it, even from the professional eye. So as Dimsdale's laying there, Chillingworth walks up to him, put his hand on his chest, and then thrust aside the vestment, so like opened his shirt. Which before now has always covered, it's always been covered, even to his professional eye. So Chillingworth, in all his examinations of Dimsdale, has never seen his chest. We also know that Dimsdale is constantly clutching at his chest. It used to just be like a casual gesture that he did, but it's turned into a constant habit where he puts his hand on his chest and it's like he's almost in pain. So Chillingworth wants to check it out. And now Dimsdale's asleep, so he checks it out. Then indeed Mr. Dimsdale shuddered and slightly stirred. After a brief pause, the physician turned away, but with what a wild look of wonder, joy, and horror. With what a ghastly rapture, as it were, too mighty to be expressed only by the eye and features, and therefore bursting forth through the whole ugliness of his figure, and making itself even riotously manifest by the extravagant gestures with which he threw up his arms towards the ceiling and stamped his foot upon the floor. Had a man seen old Roger Chillingworth at that moment of his ecstasy, he would have had no need to ask how Satan comports himself when a precious human soul is lost to heaven and won into his kingdom. But what distinguished the physician's ecstasy from Satan's? was the trait of wonder in it. And that's the end of the chapter. So, what does Chillingworth see on Dimmesdale's chest? The book didn't tell us. We have to guess. Whatever it was, has Chillingworth celebrating. It says that he has this extravagant gestures, and he throws up his arms towards the ceiling and stamps his foot upon the floor. He's compared to Satan celebrating a soul that he's won from heaven. So what has Chillingworth been after all this time? The truth, right? In particular, the truth about Hester's lover. And now he's had suspicions about Dimmesdale all along. And if you didn't have suspicions of your own, I think most of you do, you should have. Because at this point, we know whatever Chillingworth found tells him that Dimmesdale's the guy he's been looking for. A quick recap of the chapter. Let's see if I can move this out of the way. There's no good place. We'll just go with that. So, quick recap. Chillingworth was always a calm, kind, upright man, but obviously that's changing since he's become obsessed with finding the truth. He is convinced that Dimmesdale's hiding something from him. He baits him into this really heated discussion by mentioning some strange dark weeds that he found. He claims that they came from a dead man's heart on account of unconfessed sins. Dimmesdale ends up kind of storming out of the conversation. It takes a little while, but it happens. In the midst of that, Hester and Pearl walked through. We have yet another exchange where Pearl seems strangely intuitive, where she seems to know that Chillingworth is a little bit evil. And then lastly, we have this scene where Dimmesdale's sleeping. Chillingworth creeps in to check on and examine him, and in the process discovers something. We don't know exactly what, but it causes him to secretly rejoice, much like Satan would do or might look when he's celebrating winning a soul. So, if you didn't know already, we're confident that Dimmesdale is, in fact, Pearl's father.